afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with you in Chasing Dragons to talk about a fundamental topic on environmental management in Latin America. Thank you, Alex and Juan, for inviting me in this special occasion. At the OECD, we are convinced that ESG investing has become a leading form of sustainable finance due to its perceived potential to deliver financial returns, align with societal values, and contribute to climate and biodiversity-related objectives. The environmental E-pillar score of ESG rating has become an important component of ESG investing, as the E-pillar is being increasingly used as a proxy for asset selection aligned with carbon neutrality goals. Let me put this slide because aligning and increasing financial flows with low emission resilient development pathways is now more critical than ever to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid a 1.5 degrees scenario, and of course, to deliver on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDGs. In order to do that, the OECD is recommending 6 transformative areas, and the one that is related or relevant for my presentation today is that what it says in the right circle at the top of the slide: reset the financial system in line with long-term climate risks and opportunities by fixing biased incentives, capability gaps, and inadequate climate risk disclosure and pricing that are hindering the allocation of finance to net zero and resilient infrastructure. These recommendations was done before the pandemic and before COP25 in Madrid and COP26 in Glasgow. Infrastructure sits at the very center of development pathways and underpins economic growth, productivity, and well-being. Yet, infrastructure has suffered from chronic underinvestment for decades in both developed and developing countries or economies. The OECD estimates that almost $7 trillion a year is required up to 2030 to meet climate and development objectives. Furthermore, current energy, transport, building, and water infrastructure make up more than 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. An unprecedented transformation of existing infrastructure system is needed to achieve the world's climate and development objectives. Aligning financial flows with low-emission, resilient development pathways is now more critical than ever to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we can grow, by the way, 5% of the GDP globally. But the trillions that we need are not even remotely mobilized. The Climate Policy Initiative is tracking global climate finance for several years. In its latest report, total climate finance increased over the last decade, reaching $632 billion. However, with these, we cannot limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. According with the Climate Policy Initiative, climate finance must increase by at least 590%. They are talking about 4.35 trillion annually by 2030 to meet climate objectives. In Glasgow, the UK government made a call to the entire financial system, which attended the meeting chaired by Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, and Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, created during the COP26, announced that their 130 trillion US dollars of assets will be available to support the transition to net zero by 2050. The Coalition on Climate Resilient Investment, another important gathering of financial institutions, which focuses on better pricing physical climate risks, has expanded its membership to include organizations with $20 trillion of assets under management. So the central banks and supervisors network for greening the financial system and the coalition of finance ministers for climate action supported COP26 deliverables, the outcomes, and recognized that carbon taxation, emissions, trading systems, and ESG can be the most cost-efficient instruments for the climate neutrality transition. Also, there was, during the COP26, a reaffirmation of the duty to fulfill the $100 billion commitment, this time in a more transparent way, plus a call to double the provision of finance by developed countries for adaptation by 2025. The long-term finance agenda were subject of discussion at COP27, and a two-year work program to discuss the post-2025 finance will take place in the following 3 years. As you can see in the slide, the record pledges amounted to 356 million for the adaptation fund and 413 million for the least developed countries fund. So this is almost, but not yet, a trillion. So it was an important part of the things that happened during the COP26. The first commitment, and this is a quite important situation right now in the climate negotiation, the first global commitment to climate finance made in 2009 at the failed COP15 in Copenhagen. This is still pending. The commitment to mobilize $100 billion each year is fundamental in the current implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. As you may know, the OECD monitors the mobilization of these resources. We are tracking the money, and we estimate that the goal of achieving $100 billion each year for from developed to developing countries, which was to be met in 2020, will be met this or next year. So in the meantime, to talk about the trillions, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero arrived to Sharm el-Sheikh with $153 trillion in real assets, so they increased the original amount, and a set of voluntary recommendations and guidelines to align financial operations of its more than 550 members. They increase the membership of the GFANs. And this is relevant for the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement, but also for the implementation of the Glasgow Pact. GFANs recognizes the need for other actors in the financial ecosystems to contribute to the net zero effort, including through more granular and fit-for-purpose sector pathways, higher ambition public policy, higher ambition action by the real economy, and the development of relevant methodologies and accounting practices. So they are providing guidance and recommendations in parallel to the ESG systems that are in place in the financial institutions. So we started to talk about the trillions here with them, but now in the GEF, we are not seeing trillions in the GEF or the GEF, the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund that are the means of implementation of the Paris Agreement. That is important. Phasing out fossil fuel plants and extraction facility are the most relevant discussion right now. In this graph, that is also part of the GFAN's documents, you can see in the right side the title "Retire Dirty Early Facilities Wage in the Policy Scenarios." And we have to do it especially with coal mines and unabated coal-fired power plants or power facilities without carbon capture and storage control equipments. So it seems to be an important part of the G-FAN's initiatives and the guidelines that are suggesting to their members. That's the meaning of the Make It Dirty Cleaner wage. And this is also relevant in this other slide that I'm showing here, this complex and unreadable summary of the recommendations made by GFANs to financial institutions, just to show that they are including all greenhouse gases in their recommendations and the necessary removals in the climate neutrality equation, like as I was mentioning, the industrial carbon capture and storage, a technology needed in hard-to-abate industries as iron and steel and cement plants. Let me move to this more complex slide because I'm including here some chemical acronyms. No, this slide shows the relevance of all greenhouse gases, as I was saying, in the climate neutrality equation, especially short-lived climate forces or climate pollutants as methane, nitrous oxide, black carbon, that is a soot from ships or heavy-duty diesel vehicles, air conditioning gases, F-gases, or even carbon monoxide that is mainly emitted by passenger cars. These greenhouse gases are more relevant in climate policies this decade than CO2 due to its immediate toxicity in urban areas and the climate effects of them, and should be included in ESG metrics and reports. During Sharm el-Sheikh negotiations, the countries included the metrics update and the methane issues in the COP27 decisions. I made this summary to look in just one slide, the main outcomes from the COP27. Let me attract your attention to the numbers. You can add the pledges or the pledge donations in golden color and see not the billions or trillions needed to avoid a planetary climate crisis, but only the few millions committed in Egypt. If we look at the materiality of the global investments in energy transition, $500 billion in 2020, in percentage of the global energy mix, and of course, compared with the dominance of fossil fuels, you can figure out the magnitude of the change we are aiming for in both the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact. But what is the real problem we are facing right now? In this slide, you can see the amount of CO2 that can be emitted if existing extraction plants announced by fossil fuels companies become a reality. 936 gigatons of CO2 instead of 580. The carbon budget to avoid 1.5 degrees is the amount of emissions that the fossil fuel industry is planning to meet in the following years. This means that staying below 1.5 degrees may require governments and companies not only to cease licensing and development of new fields and mines, but it implies leaving almost 40% of developed reserves of fossil fuels unextracted. Due to the economic crisis derived from the pandemic, the unjust war in Ukraine, and the shortage of fossil fuels in Europe, the oil and gas companies received this year more subsidies. These are our numbers at the OECD, more investments, and more policy support. For them, we are talking about the trillions. So I think that we have to change the priorities in the policy development. A recent IEA analysis shows Sharm el-Sheikh climate pledges by governments, if fully achieved, no greenwashing, of course, would limit the global temperature rise to 1.7 degrees. This is an improvement during COP27 from Glasgow, of course. Nevertheless, much more is needed to align energy policies and investments to be faithful to the necessary trajectory of 1.5 degrees. Let's see what happens at COP28 in Dubai, because it's another oil and gas country that is relevant in the negotiations. As we enter the decade for delivery, as the IPCC is mentioning, the OECD believes that a whole of economy approach is needed to realize the net zero transition. This includes focusing not only on upscaling zero or near zero emitting technologies and low carbon businesses, but also supporting the progressive lowering of emissions in high emitting and hard to abate sectors. In this context, transition finance, for example, the financial resources needed to support just transition projects from coal industry to clean options, is gaining traction among governments and market participants. And a number of approaches relating to transition finance have emerged and are continuing to emerge. The OECD is at the forefront of work on transition finance, trying to identify barriers and offering solutions, because we believe that this is a key important strategy of the financial system. Recent OECD work on the topic highlights that current differences in taxonomies, guidelines, and market-based frameworks can fragment markets and reduce investors' confidence. ESG investing has become a leading form of sustainable finance and has shifted from early stages of development towards mainstream finance in a number of OECD jurisdictions. Markets are increasingly using ESG investing approaches to improve risk management and long-term value and greening the financial system. That is the main purpose of this conversation today. And the main message that I would like to give to you, but it is in accordance with the things that are happening here. When they are conscious of protecting the environment, how companies are securing the materiality and profitability of their climate investments, well, for the time being with ESG investing or ESG rating systems. But despite interest in ESG, it seems that there is an incipient but growing investment in it in the private sector. And as you can see in this slide with numbers coming from JP Morgan, this is evident. So also from JP Morgan, it is clear that companies are moving faster to green and sustainable financial instruments, mainly, of course, in Europe and North America that have robust climate policy frameworks and legislation. The Research and Analysis Division of the Economist Group launched this year an ESG risk rating report in April, and we can observe a low and moderate risk in Latin America and Caribbean countries in comparison with Africa and Asia that are more risky. And this is an important information because there are, of course, many global analyses of how to move from a highly pollutant to low carbon economies faster using this kind of information. So we have to consider that the ESG financial ecosystem consists of a number of different and diverse market participants who are all involved in the development and assessment of ESG information, ratings, indices, approaches, and products. So they compete with each other, and they are independent actors, mainly delivering on voluntary basis. The first set of actors include issuers of capital instruments, such as government, businesses, and financial institutions that issue debt and equity in financial markets. Each of these issuers are increasingly providing a non-financial information on environmental, social, and governance issues. Secondly, there are providers, typically third parties of ESG rating and ESG indices. ESG rating providers include firms that provide sustainability metrics and information supported by qualitative and quantitative assessment of the non-financial disclosure by issuers. Some of these rating providers are also developing ESG indices. Thirdly, these outputs are then used by asset managers that employed ESG approaches to develop ESG influence investment portfolios and funds. Asset managers may include institutional investors that are asset owners or funds that are in turn distributed to institutional and retail investors. So data in the whole system, because of this diversity, is not yet reliable. It's not standardized, and benefits, that take time to materialize and can vary depending on the regions that I show in the previous slide. So the OECD released this year a policy guidance to reinforce the role of ESG investing on transition and transition finance, or on transitioning to climate neutrality future. And let me do a summary of them in this slide. First, policymakers, financial authorities, and central banks were appropriate within their domestic mandates should strengthen the ability of reliable and quality ESG data and metrics in line with global baseline standards. There is a need, because at the moment, or for the moment, we do not have these global baseline standards. We have to develop that. They should identify and use the tools available to support greater transparency of ESG ratings methodologies and oversight, of course, ESG rating providers. Authorities should support the development of transition plans by financial intermediaries that include overall net zero and interim targets. This is really important. Because we have to see, for the moment, only 40% of these GFANS members are adopting climate neutrality goals and plans, but we have to see these transition plans with quantitative targets and, of course, different pathways to reach these to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. They have to align their own trajectories to the Paris Agreement goals. We think that all actors should collaborate within international fora to share good practices and continually strengthen the appropriate use of net zero strategies and associate tools for financial firms who have made voluntary net zero commitments. Why we are suggesting these policies? Well, amid an increasing number of companies setting decarbonization targets, there appears to be little relationship between E scores, greenhouse gas emissions, and carbon intensity for the majority of companies analyzed by the OECD. The lack of alignment between outright greenhouse gases emissions and emission intensity could suggest that the firm's disclosure of plans to reduce emissions play a significant positive role in determining their E-pillar scores rather than their current level of emissions, because all this is about mitigation efforts. So we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So when assessing the 3-year change in emission intensity, you can see the dots in this slide representing more than 2,500 companies. There is also no alignment between firms that show a high E-pillar scores. This suggests that past efforts to reduce carbon footprint and intensity are not factored into the assessment of firms' availability to deliver on forward-looking commitments. Using a sectorial approach, let me now give you an example. You know that oil and gas companies are recently being under pressure to shift toward more sustainable business models, at least before the Ukraine conflict, as investors are increasingly preferring to reduce their exposure to climate change, which increases the risk of stranded assets. We develop this graph for illustration purposes only, and the analysis of 8 scoring companies shows none has emissions in line with scenarios in the medium term. Similarly, only one company shows a carbon performance in line with the 1.5-degree scenario by 2050. For though a small sample set, these results are consistent with previous findings showing disclosure and target setting as being the main driver of high EE scores. Well, some oil companies are setting long-term targets for decarbonization and investing in R&D and renewable energy assets. This seems not to be captured by greenhouse gas emissions reduction expectations. Finally, I would like to highlight new policy considerations for the ESG ratings that are important in climate transition to net zero futures. Of course, strengthen disclosure-based metrics, further strengthen TCFD disclosure practices, integrate better quality metrics, as I was explaining, improve transparency on subcomponents of all the system, and encourage climate transition surveillance. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this summary of the things that are relevant for the OECD on ESG financing or investing systems is happening. Thank you very much.